Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. This is a very international webinar today, since our panelists are everywhere from Taipei to Europe to here in on the East Coast of the US. So welcome. We'll just wait for a few minutes here and let a few more people come in before we get started. Okay. So let's begin. So this webinar today is co-hosted by the Center for Khmer Studies and also the New York Southeast Asia Network. I'm Eve Zucker. I'm going to be moderating this panel today, and I'm also a contributor because I also am a contributor to the book which we will be discussing today, which is Cambodia's Trials. Here it is, Contrasting Visions of Truth, Transnational Justice, and National Recovery. And the editors are Robin Biddulph and Alexandra Kent. So we'll do those introductions in just a moment. First, I want to get some housekeeping here out of the way. The webinar will run for an hour and a half. We will be presenting the book in the first hour or so, and then we will have a Q&A period. So I invite all of you in the audience to submit your questions then into the Q&A box that you'll find on the bottom of your screen, and then we will get to those questions at the end. This webinar is being recorded, so please bear that in mind. And that's basically it for the housekeeping part of it. So let's begin the webinar as far as getting into the discussion. So this book, Cambodia Trials, Contrasting Visions of Truth, Transitional Justice, and National Recovery, examines the complex and often contested narratives surrounding truth, justice, and national recovery in post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia. And it's a truly remarkable collection by really fantastic contributors and experts on these topics. And it brings in multiple perspectives in considering those issues. And now I'd like to introduce the editors that worked very hard to put this amazing volume together. And so first I'd like to introduce Alexandra Kent. Professor Kent is a leading expert on religion and politics. She began her work in Indonesia and Malaysia and later moved to her studies to Cambodia in 2002. Professor Kent held the position of Associate Professor of Social Anthropology, formerly at the Gothenburg Institute in Sweden, until her recent retirement. The focus of her research on Cambodia includes various efforts to recover moral order in the wake of the Khmer Rouge era, exploring the topics through the lenses of Khmer Buddhism, gender and religion, contemporary clientelism, human rights, impunity, and economic change. Co-editing the volume is Professor Robin Biddulph. Professor Biddulph is an associate professor in human geography at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. He has lived in Cambodia initially for 10 years, starting in 1991, working as a lecturer at the University of Phnom Penh. And then following that, he worked as a manager of humanitarian mine clearance with Halo Trust and also as a research evaluation consultant. And those jobs ran all the way through 2001. His PhD dissertation, Geographies of Evasion, examined the effects of systematic land titling and community forestry in Cambodia. And his current research interests include rural livelihoods and tourism in Cambodia and land tenure reform in Tanzania, as well as housing policy in Sweden. So quite a variety of areas and interests. We also have with us today two additional contributors to the book. The book in total has 12 different chapters in it with 12 different, I think actually 13 contributors in all. We have two of with us today. So first I'd like to introduce, some of you may know, Professor Courtney Work. Professor Work is an associate professor at the Department of Ethnology at the National Chengchi University in Taiwan, and twice a CKS fellow. Her research is focused Yep. Her research is focused in the rural areas, especially in regions transforming from forest to developed settled landscapes. Professor Work has a wide range of expertise and interests, including topics in anthropology of religion, development and the environment, the history of Southeast Asian political formations, and the contemporary political economy of climate change. Her current work is focused on interactions between humans and the human and non-human world in the context of changing environmental conditions, with an emerging focus on socio-spatial relationships with plants, medicine, and free nature. And now I would like to introduce also Professor Padraig McAuliffe. Professor McAuliffe is a professor in the School of Law and Social Justice at the University of Dundee in Scotland. He is the author of two books, Transitional Justice and Rule of Law in Construction, and Rule of Law Reconstruction, A Contentious Relationship, and also the volume Transformic Transitional Justice and the Malleability of Post-Conflict States. He is the editor of the International Journal of Transitional Justice, and he received his PhD and Bachelor's of Civil Law at the University College Cork in Ireland. His interests include transnational justice, the historic institutionalism, and socioeconomic rights and social justice reform. And I'll just briefly introduce myself, since as a contributor also of the volume, I'm a sociocultural anthropologist and a research affiliate of Yale University, and my research focuses on the social, moral, and digital dimensions of remembrance and recovery after mass atrocities in Southeast Asia and beyond. My experience with the tribunal goes back to the time I worked on the Cambodian genocide program at Yale with Ben Kiernan and Craig Etchison. Later, I turned to anthropology to explore the processes of social memory in the aftermath of mass violence, focusing on memory, moral order, ritual, and everyday practices. So that's us. So let's get started here with our discussion. And maybe we start with, so if you don't mind, if nobody objects, and since we all know each other, I think I'll use first names from here on out. So Robin, starting with you, maybe you can say a word or two about the impetus for this book, and a little bit about that history.
Yes, Alex, do you want me to do that, or would you like to?
I'd be very grateful if you wouldn't mind, Robin. Yeah.
Right. So the book began with a research project that Alex had funded by a Swedish research council called Vetenskapsrådet, looking at the relationship between the Khmer Rouge Tribunal and notions of justice in Cambodia. As that project unfolded, Alex became poorly and wasn't able to do all of the fieldwork she hoped for. So she became involved in collaborations with a number of Cambodian researchers. So the idea behind the book in the beginning really was to involve opportunities for Cambodian researchers who were involved in the research to also become published. And I became involved at that stage as well, largely because Alex was poorly and I could help out, rather than because I'm a specialist in transitional justice or anything like that. And then over time, it's been quite a long journey, because we got slightly delayed by the COVID pandemic. We grew. We were up to around 24 authors at one point, most of those Cambodian. and then gradually for various reasons that slimmed down to the volume you've got now with the 12 chapters. And I guess the more specific focus of the original research project on just conceptions of justice, that continues to be a central theme in the book. But I think we became a little bit broader than that, thinking more in terms of just where are we at with how Cambodia is coming to terms with its past, with that period 1975 to 1979, and what came before and what came after, and what role did the Khmer Rouge Tribunal play in that process. So still obviously very interested in justice, but also interested in a broader set of ways that people are trying to come to terms with that past. And obviously one of the things that comes out in a number of chapters in the book is that for those people who are old enough who actually did go through that time, it's still extremely fresh in the memories. So the number of people who lived through that and remember it is getting smaller and smaller as a portion of the population. But it's still a lot of very vivid memories that are still very active in people's minds, and the way they think about themselves, the way they think about the country. So yes, I guess that's the book.
Thank you. That's fascinating. So tell me a little bit more about. See, the book is divided into 3 different sections. Can you talk a little bit about that? You know, how did you decide to divide it up that way? And what other, you know, those are obviously 3 prominent themes, but are there any other 3 themes that you wish to also raise before we get into the chapters?
Yes. So the first section of the book we've called context, and there are so many different things you have to start thinking about before you just arrive at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and both theoretically, which is where Podrick comes in, and we can listen to him in a second, talking about ways of understanding what transitional justice might be and how that might be thought about theoretically, but also other aspects of what's peculiar to the situation in Cambodia. Well, I guess I won't go into more detail about the chapters in the first section, beyond saying that we felt the need for some background and some context to start thinking into the Khmer Rouge period and what that meant. And then the section on the second section, which is called interactions, does have the Khmer Rouge Tribunal itself a little bit more in focus. For the most part, not so much the internal workings of the court, although that does play a role in some of the chapters, particularly the first of the 4 chapters. But really more interested in the outreach, in how what were the ripple effects in wider society of the tribunal, and what difference was it making more broadly. And then finally, the third section, looking beyond the tribunal. Obviously, at this point in time, with the tribunal having finished, is a time for reflection, not only on kind of what did the tribunal contribute, but also taking stock of where are things at generally. So looking at various different aspects of how people are coming to terms with the past at the moment, in a variety of different ways. So my chapter, looking at kind of some of the obvious kind of national scale events and seeing how those played out in the countryside, as compared to something like Caroline Bennett's chapter on ghosts, where she kind of tells a story of what role ghosts and the care of ghosts has played, and how that has changed over the 4 decades. So looking at other things apart from trials and trial-like things that might tell a story about how people today are thinking about democratic Kampuchea and that period and the kind of the suffering and the atrocities that happened at that time. So that's how we've structured the book. And I don't think we had many thoughts about any other structure. I think that worked quite nicely. There's lots of other themes bubbling away in the different chapters.
Yeah, there certainly is. And Alex, did you want to add anything to that? Alex is having a little trouble speaking, just for everybody out there. Um, so it's
I'll jump in if as and when, if that's okay. Otherwise, I just stay quiet. I think that's
okay.
okay.
Great. Okay. So yeah, I wanted to say that, one of the remarkable things about both the two of you actually, is that Robin, you've been, in visiting and living in Cambodia on and off for such a long period of time through various phases of, before the tribunal was even getting started, and then, through all the ins and outs of its making and then later its aftermath. So you have this sort of long perspective. And Alex, you did the book with David Chandler, People of Virtue, and that was what, in early 2000s. And, at that time, when that was being put together, again, we were in a whole different place with the tribunal. So it's interesting to see and reflect back on that trajectory and the many and how much has changed, and also some things that haven't in Cambodia. And, I think that it's, who would have, thought, back a number of years ago, we'd be sitting here on this panel today. So things have really come a long way. And I think that the volume really sort of reflects those many transitions that have taken place and pulled in so many different angles of ways of looking at the tribunal and looking more generally at the Khmer Rouge past and the memory of the past and the recovery period. And, and it certainly opens up thinking for the future. So why don't we turn it over now and to Padraig to introduce his chapter a little bit, because it gives them a very nice basis from a legal standpoint of thinking about the ECC tribunal. Padraig?
Thanks, Eve. Well, as Robin says, the early chapters are there sort of for context, because they were trials, they were a legal process. I'm a scholar of international law, transitional justice, and the rule of law. I don't have the anthropological or geographical background of many of the contributors to the book. So what I tried to bring to the book, I suppose, was a theoretical perspective on what the trial was and how it applies in Cambodia, and perhaps broader lessons that we can draw from it, because Cambodia and its experience is actually very typical of how transitional justice applies elsewhere. So I started, like most lawyers do, by just looking at trials. I was buried in documents and judgments from cases like case 1, case 2, case 3, and I saw the problems in the trials as they proceeded. There were problems with judicial appointments, kickbacks for positions in the court. There were some restrictions on evidence. There were some disputes between the prosecutors, the international and domestic co-prosecutor. There were some split judgments between the international judges and the domestic judges as well. So it became clear that the trials were somewhat politicized in a way that perhaps wasn't anticipated by the international community at the start. And my background in transitional justice, I think, equips me to look at some of the reasons why that is the case. Because again, there's nothing terribly unusual about what happened with the Khmer Rouge trials. And I started by saying that some of the explanations we had for the failure of the trial were a little unsatisfactory. there was this idea that the trials were started to pursue international legitimacy, and they continued in their compromise way to guarantee international legitimacy. But I think that's an unconvincing explanation. International legitimacy is not something the Hun Sen government were overly concerned with in an increasingly Sino-centric world. People argued that there was a certain fear of incrimination on the part of the present government. I don't think that was realistic. I don't think Hun Sen or anyone in the present government could conceivably have come before the tribunal given their lack of seniority. There was some arguments that the fear of unrest explained the compromises of the trial. But again, I wasn't convinced that that was a good explanation either, simply because there wasn't that much unrest for most of the trial. But I did sort of come to this realization, one that many other people did, that a transitional justice frame, as we normally think about it, wasn't a very suitable one for this. Transitional justice was developed as a concept in the transitions to democracy in Latin America in the 1980s, or Eastern Europe in the late 80s and early 90s. And they were transitions to what we would consider liberal democracy. Cambodia's path has been something very different. So my chapter basically argues we need new theoretical approaches, and we need to figure out where transitional justice fits in broader or different political cultures beyond liberal democracy. And the experience of Cambodia and other places like Rwanda or Lebanon suggest to us that we need to get away from this no preconditions approach to transitional justice, this idea that accountability or justice can be pursued unproblematically in almost any state. Because often political will is missing, often the necessary stability is missing, often the administrative capacity to make trials work is missing, and sometimes just the surrounding political culture is very different. I looked at some political institutionalism, the idea of access orders by North, Wallace and Weingast, just as a way to try and think outside the box of the liberal democratic paradigm that usually applies to transitional justice. Cambodia has some of the hallmarks of what political scientists and institutional historians call limited access orders, where states are somewhat insecure, and so they rely on personalized institutions and rents, as opposed to sort of the familiar institutions, or the institutions that are familiar to people, certainly in the global West. So like I said, Cambodia's experiences is very like that of other countries like Rwanda, Lebanon, Burundi, who also don't really fit the liberal democratic paradigm. And basically what the Khmer Rouge trials suggest is that where the goals of a tribunal are out of sync with the surrounding political economy or political culture, they are unlikely to succeed, because meaningful, independent transitional justice or criminal accountability can call into question the present-day allocations of power in a given state, particularly that between the executive and the judiciary. I made the sort of analogy at the time that expecting the Khmer Rouge to do what it did in Argentina or in Chile or Peru was like expecting a flower to bloom in the desert. And I still think that is true, but I think the lessons from Cambodia are very applicable now. The world is sort of turning away from the liberalizing direction where international tribunals and transitional justice emerged. The world is quite different. I think the lessons from Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge trial are very applicable across the world right now, perhaps in a way I didn't anticipate when Robin and Alex asked me to write the chapter.
Thank you. Very, very interesting indeed. And I just want to say to the other panelists, if there's something you want to ask a question about or respond to, or you want to make a further comment on something, when anybody speaks, this is a discussion, so feel free to jump in. no need to raise a hand or anything like that. So okay, well, that's really very fascinating. Courtney, maybe you want to talk a little bit about your chapter. It's a very fascinating chapter, and definitely an angle that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily expect or immediately think about when they think about a tribunal in Khmer Rouge past and so forth. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I will talk about that. Thank you, Eve, and thanks to everybody for coming, especially thanks to Alex and Robin for putting this book together. It really is a fascinating book, the way that all of the pieces and all of the takes in each chapter show these different pieces and very disparate pieces of the puzzle. And I'm glad to follow Padraig on this, because I appreciate his critique of what transitional justice is and how it plays out and how it played out in Cambodia, and especially the framing of it from this sort of international top-down standard of what is supposed to happen. And in many ways, my chapter on ecocide is very much in the same vein as that the transition to democracy and a market economy has quite literally decimated the life support system of this really vibrant country. When I first started coming to Cambodia, I would joke with my friends and say, this is the richest poor country I've ever been in. You know, every time it would rain, there were fish in the puddles, right? Everything was growing everywhere. And now it's not. And my framing of ecocide in this context is not my own idea. This was given to me by the people that I work with at the edge of what used to be a really massive and dense and rich forest, and is now mostly cashew fields and cassava fields with some trees left. And really, I was shocked the first time I heard someone that I've known, and this was after I'd met him a couple of times already, and this was after they started putting roads up in northern Stung Treng, and the roads were coming in and development was coming in, and it really transformed the landscape. And he said, you know, Pol Pot wasn't that bad. He only killed the people. Now everything's gone. Oh, well, that was a completely different take on this situation, the idea that everything is gone. And this ties into a number of elements that are important to people that I work with in the forest. And I think that everybody on this panel that spent time in Cambodia knows that these things are important, that there are social relationships beyond the human relationships. There are social relationships with trees and with bodies of water and with rocks that are often carved into statues that communicate with people. And so the loss of this is a real and visceral loss in ways that the stories are not the same as the stories that people tell of losses during the Khmer Rouge, but they are stories of loss of their rich forest, loss of their rich lifestyles, and loss of of all of the economically embedded culture that created lives in this context. And so that was what I wrote about, and in a kind of a critical way of the international community, really, and of this, and I feel like Padraig points to this a little bit. Padraig points to this a little bit in the, and this has been said of critiques of these trials as well. There is a sort of a utopian vision that comes from places where the genocides are already cooled, and where the land has been completely transformed, and where people's relationships to their food is non-existent, and where it looks like there is such a thing as justice and accountability and bureaucracies that actually function without patrimonial networks. And I think that this is as much a fiction. I think that we are seeing this now, that is as much a fiction as the idea of transitional justice is. And 20 years later, Padraig said that Hun Sen was not really concerned about international legitimacy, and I almost jumped in. Eve, I'm glad you've given me permission. Now I might do that again. but my immediate question, or my immediate thought, was that I always pictured the trials as an act of international legitimacy on the part of the international community, to say, like, yeah, actually, you guys, what we did here was really great. Look at how great we are. And it was, in my experience, it was meaningless to the Cambodian people. I was doing field work at the time. I was just starting my field work out in a village in Kampong Chhnang. And I thought, when this trial started, I thought, oh, this could be really interesting to connect the trials to my field work. And so I went around for a few weeks asking everybody about them and what they thought, and people were not interested. Well, I don't know. Well, I don't have a radio, and it's so long ago now, and I don't know. And so that was really interesting. And then to have a person that I know in a forest where clearly it has been completely transformed in a very, very short period of time, tell me that killing the people was not really that bad, that killing the forest might be worse, was really stark. And so my paper focuses on that, and it focuses on ecocide as a concept, as a phenomenon, as a global phenomenon. And it focuses really on the role of the international community in the transition out of the Khmer Rouge era, and the sort of spectacular hypocrisy that was involved in that, and the fact that Khmer Rouge leaders were sitting in Cambodia's seat in the United Nations, while the ASEAN nations and the forest destroyers in all of Southeast Asia were boycotting Cambodia because Vietnam invaded them. But I don't know. I have not talked to anybody in the rural areas that considers the Vietnamese ouster of the Khmer Rouge to be an invasion. I have not ever heard anybody say that that's what it was. And so, and then later to have these same people, right? The only living person that is in prison right now was the person sitting in Cambodia's seat at the United Nations during the years between the ending of the Khmer Rouge and the beginning of the transition. So my chapter focuses on that, on the fact of ecocide. And one of the things that comes out of this coupling of ecocide and genocide that for me is really important, and it is possible that the kind of alienation, the kind of violence that is required to completely destroy a vital and vibrant forest landscape for the sake of money, and to destroy all of the social relationships that are embedded in that space, might be connected to the genocides that haunt civilization and always have. And so I guess I will leave it at that.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Courtney. Yeah, you just had me thinking a little bit about the period after the Khmer Rouge, when they were on the Thai border and smuggling vast amounts of timber and gems and wildlife, etc., over the border to finance themselves during that time. And that's before the large, plantations came in there, the cassava plantations and so forth, and they were pretty much decimating the forests then. And there was also earlier periods as well in some areas prior to even when they came into power. And I've heard it, some of the destruction that they did themselves likened to earlier periods in Cambodian history during the Thai invasions, when things were, where people's livelihoods were smashed along with the temple drums and everything else. So there's these stories of destruction that are carried through different episodes in Cambodian history, and of course stories of recovery that come with that. So it's not always destruction. That Cambodian culture has a remarkable amount of resources within it to manage rupture, to manage disruption, and rebuild within their culture. Robin, yeah, please.
But yeah, I suppose just reflecting on the issues around forests this is not so much connected to the research in the book, but my PhD research, one of my villages was in a forest village in Krache, and that was a village where local Khmer Rouge had a number of them had defected into the village. So it was a village where you'd both got people who hadn't been part of the Khmer Rouge, who'd lived in that village, and people who'd been part of the Khmer Rouge who'd come in. And this was a kind of thick forested village. And over the period of since peace, basically, since they stopped fighting, you've had a logging company in there, and then the logging company scaled down its operations, but was recruiting local people to cut down the timber. So 2006, 2009, I was kind of watching a lot of local logging and the forest being thinned out. I've been back in the last couple of years, and there's no forest left. I'm sure it's a familiar sight to Courtney, where you just rubber, cassava, cashew, and lots of red dirt where you used to see kind of green. But I didn't really see that as particularly coupled to to political allegiances, and there's kind of a lot of complicity. So local villagers themselves, again, both former Khmer Rouge and former government people, who felt a lot of emotional attachment to the forest, but who at the same time had been complicit in clearing the forest and turning it into agricultural land, and who are now feeling very relieved that they kind of got away with it and they've been able to keep that former forest as agricultural land. So there's a kind of emotional regret that we've lost the forest and the richness of the forest, but nobody wants to go back in time to the time it was a rich forest. They're happier to have the roads, the medicines, the television, the mobile phones, all of the things that have come with development. So there's definitely something that you could call an ecocide, but there isn't the kind of, I don't recognize it at any rate from that research. I don't recognize the sort of trauma that I see in relation to the 1975-1979 period, when people talk about that kind of the sustained experience of fear, sustained experience of hunger, sometimes seeing violence, but more often just seeing people led away and never seeing them again. That seems to me to have left a kind of trauma 40 years later that I don't sense when you see the kind of the loss of the landscape and the loss of the kind of being able to go down to the river and flip out a fish that looks like that, whereas now it's difficult to find a fish that looks like this. But there's a kind of sentimental loss about that is nevertheless doesn't have to be dealt with in quite the same way. I don't know, that was just my reflection.
That's interesting, because one of the things that the people in the areas where I work, they were Robin, maybe there was not a big economic land concession that came into that area, because the kind of, a lot of the trauma that people talk about is from these major concessions that come in, big land concessions come in, and suddenly the entire forest is gone. And they take everything, and they take the fields that people were using, and they take the forest that people were using, and instantly the entire landscape is transformed. And yeah, that's what people talk about in the areas where I work. Those are the founding traumas, much more than the Khmer Rouge years, which is actually really interesting. Not to say that there weren't issues and that the Khmer Rouge years were not difficult. But that the real difficulty was when the companies came in and cleared the entire area and took their lifestyles out from under them.
Well, I have to say that in the areas where I've worked, it's definitely been the Khmer Rouge period and the loss of life. That was the primary, which was certainly the most traumatizing of all. Even though there were effects on the land and so forth, that without doubt it was the tearing apart of the community and the loss of many members of that community and family members. And it's still, as we know, pervasive throughout Cambodia, and any genocide or mass atrocities on any scale. That's of course the most difficult part, and it takes generations to recover from. It's hard to even say how that, how long or in what shape that process takes exactly, because we're still learning many steps along the way. So, Rob,
Sorry, I thought you were slight delay. Sorry, I cut you off.
So I thought that maybe Robin, maybe you would like to, since I thought maybe you'd like to segue into maybe some of the things that you were just talking about into your chapter a little bit, which we haven't yet heard about.
Right. Yes. Well, I did a number of interviews, not in one place, but in various places in the Northwest broadly, with people who had been, with people who are old enough to have lived through the Khmer Rouge times. And they were largely what you might term kind of grassroots CPP people, so grassroots government people. So they were people who'd been village chiefs, people who'd been teachers, people who'd worked in local administration in communes and districts. And what I was trying to get at in interviewing them was a sense of what kind of trajectory had they been on since the Khmer Rouge times, and what were the kind of key events that had made a difference over that time. So I got some ideas. So I was interested in the moment immediately after liberation, whatever that looked like in different places. And obviously in some places it was rather quick and silent. In other ways it was kind of a protracted fight for months. So it looked very different in different places. But I thought there might be might have been a moment of retribution there, of kind of local violence against people who had been perpetrators, that might have conditioned what happened next, in terms of maybe people would have enacted revenge and had enough of revenge, or not. So I was interested in that moment. I was interested in whether people were aware of the first trial in 1979, whether there were any ripples of that, which really there weren't. The I think there was only one person who'd heard of it, and one person kind of was, oh wow, that sounds like a really good idea. That's why it's good if they did do that. But and then I was interested in the 1993 elections, which I was obviously in Cambodia for a couple of years before those. So I was there for the build-up. I was an election observer both in Phnom Penh and up in Banteay Mean Chey, because the elections took part over 2 days, so you could be in different places. And I remember the sense of, especially in the countryside, people coming across the fields and coming to the polling stations, and really there being an atmosphere of joy and excitement, and it felt like a significant turning point. So I was interested to see how people talked about that and thought about that, and then also the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, to what extent, whether people remembered when the prime ministers sent the letter to request the tribunal, and then also when the tribunal itself, what they remembered and what they thought had made a difference. And perhaps not surprisingly, but really to a very large extent, none of these events seem to have stayed in the memory in ways that had really affected people. So the trauma that people described was still very fresh in their minds. The elections often were very, even the 93 election, were people couldn't remember where they voted. They were kind of vague about that. So listening to recollections, that didn't seem to have been a kind of threshold moment in the way that I kind of assumed it might have been. The tribunal, different to some of Courtney's respondents, then there was quite a lot of people who well, I only had 10 respondents, but a number of them who did talk about being quite curious about the trial and quite interested, and some of them for personal reasons, who'd got relatives and they wanted to know kind of what had happened to them and how had that happened and who was responsible. Particularly one person who was the son of a senior Khmer Rouge leader, in fact, who had been killed by the regime, but also on a much more kind of visceral, how could Khmer do this to Khmer? There was a kind of hope that the tribunal might answer that question, as well as some kind of search for kind of both revenge, but also some kind of accounting for. I think they wanted to hear somebody confess fully to everything, say this is what we did, and kind of apologize for it. And so and as they kind of gradually realized that wasn't coming, there was a kind of disappointment that it didn't yield that. Which of course is not necessarily a reflection on the process so much as a reflection on how the accused responded. The senior Khmer Rouge people who never really kind of accepted much responsibility, and certainly not in a public way. So yes, and I suppose I was also struck. I was chatting to one person who's a commune councillor and had been in the local authorities almost the entire period since the early 80s, talking about one older person who's still alive in the village, who was with the Khmer Rouge, who had been responsible for the deaths of a number of people, mainly by reporting them, but also possibly involved in violence as well. And there was a very clear understanding that this was the person who was responsible. And he was very angry about that and definitely wanted retribution still. He still felt angry, still felt the desire for retribution on the one hand. On the other hand, he said that old guy is very old now. His children live round here. One of them's a policeman, another's a farmer in the village. And if we enacted revenge on him, then what would they do? And we don't want that. So there was a sense of some of the same dilemmas that you see throughout the book, the dilemma between trying to achieve reconciliation and the whole kind of win-win idea versus this idea of kind of trying to get at what happened and to hold people to account. So that was my chapter. A real sense, I suppose, what I took away from it was just how far away village life is from Phnom Penh. I describe these people as CPP grassroots, but they're also kind of local elites. So these are the people who are most likely to be educated in the village, most likely to have a radio, most likely to pay attention to the news. But still, these things that you think of as kind of key threshold events didn't really make much impact. It didn't seem to me in those interviews.
I think that's interesting, Robin. I wanted to comment to you about this business of remembering the election. When I was doing my field work in 2009 out in the Western provinces, I did, as you know, in rural areas, the whole business of time and reckoning time can be tricky, right? Where are we? And I did find that the election was a sort of a landmark, that I could ask, well, was it before the election or after the election? Oh, and that sort of grounded people in where they were. And so I was really surprised in reading your piece that that the people you were engaged with did not have that as a timestamp. It could be because they're more elite and because there was more going on in their lives. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that when we're doing this sort of research, when we're going down to such a small scale and such sort of small samples, that we're in the business of raising issues that then need further investigation. So I think we've got to be very, very cautious about especially drawing kind of nationwide generalizations on the basis of specific places. So we raise some questions and we kind of get some new lines of thought that maybe we didn't have before. But we're not closing any arguments here. I think we're opening them, and I think we have to be quite cautious about drawing too many
I
conclusions
think
on.
it actually sort of validates Vickery's excellent essay so many years ago, that really just said this was not a homogeneous phenomenon. It continues to not be a homogeneous phenomenon, and this standard total view of what it was or what it is not a thing. There are different experiences all over the country, and different experiences of the time and afterward of the time. Oh, Eve, I wanted to ask you, where you did your research, was there out in Kampong, did they wind up having an economic land concession in that region?
Not, well, not so far away from there, but not immediately where I was doing my research. And I mean, things keep changing, of course, as you know. But yeah, at the time, it wasn't like right there. So there wasn't too far away, but that was not the immediate thing that was happening. More, you know, one of the hardest part. I mean, there's several. You know, so much actually in terms of answers and ways of thinking about that past. Part of it has to do with, of course, generations of how old are the people, what do they remember, what would be significant for them, depending on their age and their, you know, the sort of moments in their lives that were very transitional, whether that be the elections or maybe, you know, it was moving from one place to another because of the multiple displacements that occurred before, during, and after the Khmer Rouge. So there was a lot of movements because of the Civil War largely, and then, you know, in the UNTAC period as well. So I found that, you know, sometimes, you know, what's remembered, you know, if someone was really quite old, then they might remember even back into, you know, the Sankum period and events that happened then. So it's interesting, and it will be interesting going forward to see how, you know, who is remembering what and what becomes recorded as, you know, inscribed in these memories of the past and through these framings. I'm just looking at the time, and I see that we're coming on to 9:30 p.m. in Cambodia, 9:30 in the morning here. So we've got another half hour or so, and this is a really great discussion. And you know, thank you everybody again for participating in this. I think what I would like to, since Patrick has got to run very soon, I want to ask if he would like to, if there's something he'd like to say before he has to go, and the rest of us will be on and here to answer questions. So, Patrick.
Thanks, Eve. That's very nice of you. And I do apologize for having to go. I just had this in the calendar before this meeting. I keep pressing this book on people in international law and transitional justice and telling them about it, because we're all aware that grassroots perspectives on top-down things like transitional justice are different, but this book is kind of a testament to how different it is. You see that in Courtney's chapter, you see it in your work on the GoSieve. I think it was your chapter, Alex, and it's quite a while since I read the chapters as they were coming through, but there were people getting on the bus to Phnom Penh to look at the trials, and some of them were going to the trials and some of them are not. They were doing other business in Cambodia, and that diversity of approach and experience really sort of complicates, I suppose, the way that we think about transitional justice. Everyone has a different experience, which is a little bit trite. But if you go back to sort of the mild clash earlier between the sort of a sentimental loss of ecocide or the trauma of people dying, but of course the loss of a forest in a day or in a week can mean an awful lot more than a distant trauma 30 or 40 years ago. One you possibly interact with on an everyday basis. The other is this sort of psychological trauma that you bring around with you, but possibly you don't interact with every day. The book, it was a joy to be part of it, because it just did so much to sort of show how crisscrossed and different people's experiences are. You know, intellectually that's the case before you ever think about something like a trial like this. But this book actually bears it out. It actually changed my mind an awful lot about how I think about transitional justice. But I have to say, my field research was in East Timor as opposed to Cambodia, and the interactions I had with people there are very, very similar to those that we see in the book here. Those who suffered justice directly and who were older, the trials meant a great deal more to them than people of a younger generation who either hadn't experienced it or who only heard about it, or who were more interested in development in the future than the past. So anyway, these experiences are universal. I'm very sorry that I have to go. Thanks again, Robin. Thanks again, Alex, for bringing me in on this. Anyone who hasn't read the book should. It is superb. And thank you very much. And goodbye.
Bye. Thank you, Patrick. Okay, that's interesting. And for those of you who have the chat open, you'll see that Alex also has a comment in there, basically agreeing with what Patrick was just saying of the importance of context. And looking back, and I just want to add one thing to that. Laura McGrew and I did a edited volume ourselves a while ago, and on aftermath of and recovery of mass atrocities, and there was cases from various points in the world. And one of the things that did come out was these different tensions between, especially with younger generations sometimes, but this sort of looking forward versus looking back, or, what is the interest in the aftermath of these types of events? Is it building a new modern future, a so-called modern future, or is it reflecting back on the past, or reaching back to tradition? So there's many different approaches. I'll just say a few brief words about my own chapter before we open it up into the Q&A session. So my chapter it's the last chapter in the book. And I think that part of the reason for that, it's a good place for it to be. It's very much, it's a hopeful chapter, I would say, and it's a chapter that, like Courtney's, focuses on the spirituality aspects of recovery. And the site that I focused on was in An Long Veng, which, as you all know, I'm sure, was the last bastion of the Khmer Rouge resistance, led by 𝐀𝐻 𝐬𝐭, who was one of the key leaders, and later was supposed to be tried by the ECCC. So my chapter centers around this monument, which 𝐀𝐻 had built in the mid-90s while resisting the Cambodian state at that time, fighting there on the border. And what he had done was he had commissioned basically the statue to be built of the Khmer Rouge soldiers, 3 males, 1 female, sort of honoring them, for their commitment and dedication to the cause, and for their strength in fighting and so forth. So they are carved out of this boulder, right at the sort of foothills of going up to the incline where the Thai border is. And it's a really remarkable, statuary there. And it's got a very, very interesting history. And that area, of course, has an extremely interesting history, being on the border as it is, being the, the last site of resistance of the Khmer Rouge, which, this all ended, very late 90s. In fact, it was the final attack basically by Tom Mok and his forces. Speaking of elections, happened in the 1998 elections, where that was the first time the residents of An Long Veng were going to vote as part of the Cambodian state. So a lot of history there. But one of the interesting things that's happened in that region is as it opened up, then people from other parts of the country began to enter into that area and build their livelihoods. And alongside there with former Khmer Rouge, who were really the last Khmer Rouge, and some of these followers of Tom Mok, not all of, some of them were younger generations who wouldn't even remember the Democratic Kampuchea period. So the way they looked at him and the way they understood their movement, for some of them was a little different than what was remembered from the earlier period. But in any case, that road where that statue sits in the middle of the road, is a lot of trucks come up and down that road, bringing all kinds of goods to go over the border into Thailand. So there's a lot of trade in that area, and apparently there were quite a number of accidents that were taking place on the road. And what ended up happening with these forms, these statues of these Khmer Rouge, soldiers was, initially, for a number of years after the area was retaken by the state, quite a lot of damage was done to them. It was said that, people said that, well, damage was done by the Cambodian soldiers coming in and then damaging and breaking apart some of these statues to some extent. And but over time, what happened was a huge transition, which is that they were changed, starting with the female figure, that she was slowly, she was transformed into an image of a guardian spirit, a 𝐀𝐻𝐿, and one in particular, in fact, which is Ye Bao, who is the guardian spirit who is most associated with helping people, stopping traffic accidents and so forth. She's sort of a traveler's spirit. And offerings began to be made there. And so so my chapter sort of centers around this particular statue and this transformation, and looks at the ways that this amalgamation really in this statue of space and of time and of meaning, how it shifts over time and how it absorbs the recovery of the Cambodian nation as a whole, of Cambodia as a whole, and that there's a real strong spiritual component of it. And because contradictions work in the spirit world, where things that might not work in the regular world, the spirit world, and Yvonne Guilou points to this as well, that the spirit world is capable of absorbing these contradictions. So yes, it can be a former Khmer Rouge statue, but it also can be a guardian spirit. Yes, it could be a former Khmer Rouge place, but it can also be a place for newcomers. Yes, it can, yes, and it kind of brings everything down that at the core, Cambodia as a spiritual entity, not as a political entity, but as a spiritual entity is being rehealed through these processes of absorption. It's interesting with that particular female statue that in the course of its desecration, you could say, or defacement, it was stripped down, the uniform taken off in some ways. It looked like it went through a period where you can see in Eric Davis's photos where it looks like at some point it has a belly button, and the spiritual process starts with these spiritual shrines that are added there, and then she starts to take form. But at the bottom of it, there's the story of the Cambodian woman. the Cambodian woman as soldier for the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian woman as a protectress of Ye Mao, the Cambodian woman, and she absorbs then this coming together of these different paths and these different forms, and together holds the state then back together. So I was completely fascinated by this when I saw it, and was just awed by how remarkable it is. It's such a Cambodian type of process taking place that is so outside of the tribunal that but I felt it was important to bring that in. So I won't say any more about that just right here, because you know, I want to give plenty of time for questions for everyone who's here. So yes, so let's start with some questions. I'm going to put these questions out to everybody in the panel, and whoever would like to answer them, please feel free to speak up. So we have a question here from 𝐀𝐛𝐬𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭. What are your take or thoughts since now that Cambodia is passing a law on the denial of the Khmer Rouge in Phnom Penh? Yeah, I just saw that yesterday, and I was thinking about that. I have to say a little bit during the discussion. This is the second law, in fact, against denialism of the Khmer Rouge. So does anybody want to speak to that, or should I? Or I'm happy to respond.
I would like you to respond, Eve.
Okay. Well,
Thank you.
yeah, it's very interesting. Of course, you know, there is a law in Germany, a similar law about the denial of the Holocaust. And, you know, one has to question with these passing of laws of the denial of the Khmer Rouge, you know, why would there be another reason for that? And in fact, I'm actually just working on a piece right now that has to do with denial of the Khmer Rouge. And one of the things that's happened in recent years is that the kinds of different forms of denial that are available and that are proliferated are different than what was in the past. It's not just a matter of saying that it, you know, that the you know, genocide didn't happen or something like that. It's also a matter of there's a lot of more subtle ways that it can be denied. And now that we have, you know, AI, and we have the internet, and we have social media, and we have all these different types of forms that sometimes denial can take forms that may not be that obvious. It may be that it's a distortion can be a form of denialism as well. So when I read the article, though, about denialism, they didn't mention those kinds of forms of denialism and distortion of the past. But nonetheless, there is, you know, there has been concern that of downplaying some of what has occurred, and possibly offering other narratives of who is responsible or what the numbers are. And genocide denial is rampant at the moment. It's not just Cambodia, it's all over the place. So I can understand why that might, you know, from staying, you know, from thinking of it from a global point of view, that those would be some of the reasons of just the sheer rampant number of denial cases happening at the moment. So that's, Robin, you look like you've.
No, well, I think I had one of my respondents was a kind of Khmer Rouge denier, the guy whose father was a senior Khmer Rouge leader. I think he was a deputy chief in Battambang, and was taken to Tuol and executed there. And his hope from the trial would be that he would find out what had happened to his father, but he was firmly convinced that his father was a good man, and that the that his colleagues would never have killed him. So it must have been some kind of Vietnamese conspiracy um, that resulted in his father's death. And I'm just thinking that whatever the sort of denial is that might be around it, it probably isn't laws that will stop it. It is all of the kind of research, the documentation, the films, the reality TV, all of the other things that are happening that we're kind of saying are interesting for researchers to look at. Now they stop looking at the tribunal and can start looking at other things. That the way in which that period is memorialized and the ways in which that the memories are passed on. But it's if I may link to the next question about young people, because this is something that happened during the research for this, but has been happening to me almost since I got to Cambodia, which is people my age and older saying to me, "Can you tell my children that this really happened?" So they struggle to be believed by their kids. So that this idea of getting it remembered and convincing people of what happened. And I sit there and say, well, I've read books and I've heard stories and I believe completely that this is what happened and it was as terrible as your parents say. But it's a very strange position. And I've discussed that. One theory was that just like when we were growing up in England, we're told to eat our food because people are starving in Africa. And that some parents tell their children, look, you must eat your food because we starved during the Khmer Rouge, and just somehow it's like a kind of bogeyman that doesn't get believed, but it's an important question. There's clearly an anxiety that the younger generations don't fully understand and have, especially some of my respondents who are saying, oh yes, no, we believe that this won't happen again because we remember because it's happened once and we lived through it, and so we would never let this happen again. At the same time as they're always also saying, but we're worried that our children don't believe that it happened and we're going to die soon. So that anxiety still came through, and I'm not sure whether that's what informed the question about what this means for the younger generation. But this question of can it happen again, and this idea of is it really believed and is it really kind of remembered sufficiently, was definitely coming in.
It wasn't taught. It wasn't in the schools until when it was sort of revolutionary. Eve, do you remember what was the year that they finally got a Khmer Rouge lesson into, and even then it wasn't in the younger grades, it was only in high school.
Yeah, it was like, what, about 10 years ago or something like that?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, like 2015.
Yeah, I think it was around the time, not that long after you and I were both in Cambodia in like 2010. Remember, we were across, we were both,
Yes.
yes.
Co-fellows.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just in the course of time, I just want to make sure we get to these other couple of questions here. So Robin, I think the next question would be one that you would like to answer. It has to do with talking about how people that experienced or their country people experienced mass atrocities and genocide, that they are really the people that are who have lived through this, that have the most, and the best knowledge, and was asking a little bit about the contributions, the various contributors to the book in that regard. You're on mute.
Yes. So as I was saying at the beginning, we started off with 24 authors, and most of them were Khmer, and many of them dropped out for a variety of different reasons. Some of them anxious about the publishing, and others for work pressures. It's not easy to carve a niche for yourself as a researcher where you're supported and where you have enough time to write, I think is part of the problem. But I think, being subjective, if we're allowed to do that, I think one of the best chapters in the book is definitely Savina Sirac's chapter, which is the one original chapter by a Cambodian author, where she discusses her interviews with former Khmer Rouge, and basically breaks down this idea that there's just perpetrators and victims, and shows how a lot of these people who were active members of the Khmer Rouge see themselves as victims of the whole process. But no, we had hoped, as foreigners involved in the book, to be in the minority rather than the majority, as we ended up being. We had Savina's chapter, and we had the Vandet's chapter, which was a reproduction of one that they'd previously printed. So there's still work to be done on Cambodian researchers getting a foot in the door, and we tried our best and then didn't really succeed in the way that we wanted to. I think is what we can say about that. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, shall we move to, so Eric White also had a question here. The idea and practice of justice in Southeast Asia, Theravada Buddhism, is a relatively understudied topic, especially the question of plural or contested visions of justice. And he says, I'm wondering what key insights you see in the edited volume. How do you see this edited volume in rethinking some of these issues in regards to Cambodia and/or Theravada Buddhism? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I can take a little bit of that, because I thought that a little bit as I was reading the book, that there is more than a push for revenge and for retribution. There is a push for not giving it energy, not necessarily to cover it over or to deny it, but to let it settle, and let it do its thing. And I think that some of the and you know, so Eric's question is specifically about Theravada Buddhism, but in Cambodia, it does get so intertwined with spirits and with earth in so many ways. And I think a lot of what I've heard from people, oh yeah, there was a killing field behind the village, and at the beginning it was really noisy and it was really scary and it was really hot and we were all afraid of it. But now, now it's much calmer, and sometimes we get lottery numbers, and it's a different kind of a feel. And so I feel like and then some of that comes out in some of the interviews that Robin did, and that there is this like that we wouldn't want to keep digging at that. We would want to let it pass, because we don't really know what justice is. I could get justice against this man, but then he has children, And what kind of justice is that then? That's kind of my take on Eric's question. What do you think, Eve?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I found that there was the responses. I mean, I found in my fieldwork basically that people did not want to take revenge necessarily, that that felt there was enough blood already, and that and and certain people, and and this is also in a number of other people's research, and 𝐀𝐻𝐬𝐿 and also in Laura McGrew's, and that there is that film also, what's the Deacon of Death, which also records a similar story of these former Khmer Rouge village chiefs and so forth, then doing a number of good deeds around the village, or becoming a Buddhist layman, and or doing practicing local medicine, or doing different good deeds, and earning, certainly building up their karmic repertoire. But that seems to be been accepted in many cases within the communities of that. There is a process for healing, and Buddhism is a big part of that in Cambodia, and people recognize that, and it may be a process that takes time and may not see immediate results in the kind of ways that that we think about these things in the West, but it works. It seems to work on a smaller level community levels that the tribunal really doesn't address. Those kind of, and these are cases where people are living with these people. These are their neighbors. These are, and it's difficult, but it's really quite commendable, actually. So we are running close to out of time, and I just want to say that there is some questions that regarding the availability of the book, whether it be a book launch at Siem Reap or in Phnom Penh, was a question. I can tell you that it is available in the CKS library. Hopefully there will be a digital version at some point. Maybe Robin Alex knows more about that. And so I'll let you answer that in just a minute, but I just want to add on one thing is that Helen Jarvis raised also the topic about I'll just throw this out there, not for discussion because we don't have time, but that there was also literature, a school material curriculum during the PRK period in the 1980s. So, okay, I think that's it. Robin and Alex, would you like to say anything in closing?
Just in response to that about the availability of the book, there is a copy at the Royal University of Phnom Penh Library, a hard copy, and it's in Cambodia. It's at the airport at least, so I guess Monument Books will have it. I have seen a copy advertised electronically at one of the United States University bookshop pages. I haven't clicked on to verify that that's the case, but NUS Press were saying they would try and do an electronic version, so that might be out there already, but I haven't verified that. But anybody's welcome to contact me if they're struggling to track down a copy, and I'll help them out one way or another, can I say?
Okay, well, great. It's been really fantastic having you all on this webinar today, and it's I know it's a project that was long in the making, and it really came together beautifully, and I'm sorry that some of the other contributors couldn't make it today, but we're happy to have Padraig and Courtney here, as well as Robin and Alex. And thank you also to our audience and for the great questions coming in. And I do encourage you to read the book. So have a lovely morning, afternoon, case may be.
Don't finish yet, Eve. Let's just let Alex in first, please.
Sure.
I just wanted to jump in very briefly and say that this book, it was originally my dream, but it wouldn't have happened without Robin. I had various health problems and setbacks and so on. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all the contributors, and especially to Robin for backing me up all the way through this. And it's a pleasure to see that it's out there and alive and relevant, I hope, going forwards. Big thank you.
Well, thank you. Okay, well, I think we will end the webinar then. Have a good day, evening, and week ahead. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.